Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Curator. I'm the artistic director of Bellas Artes Project. It's a non-profit based in both Makati, where there's an exhibition space, and in Bataan, where there's a residency program. And we wanted to first thank Vargas Museum, Patrick, and all of his team for welcoming us. We've already started having the pleasure of hearing David say in a more intimate setting, in a seminar under educational program that we started since last May called Eskwela. I won't give a large introduction in depth about this program, but I just wanted to open here the home of the website, and you can check yourself all of the seminars and workshops that we're doing, where we have guests coming under 5 different topics, as we ourselves are kind of like using them as a platform to think things through for future projects in the coming years. So in the case of David, because he's has so much information and has done so many incredible projects, we decided that aside from his Eskwela seminars, that he would do something different or else, which is kind of like what today's talk and conversation later with Patrick will be about. And it's basically related to 2 books that he has made. Well, I think they've been published in the past 3 years or 4, but I think you've been making them in the past 15 somehow. And quite related to trying to create a memory and history of contemporary art practices and historiography in Thailand. You will give a further better introduction. But for those who don't know David, David is Australian, based in Singapore, where he is professor at the University of Singapore in Southeast Asian Studies on Art and Culture. The department is called different, but he is definitely a key author, doing a lot of comparative art history as well, and putting up exhibitions. So not only in writing, but has made exhibitions at the House of Oral Cultures in Berlin, and most recently at the Guangzhou Biennial, amongst others. So that would do. So please welcome David.
Thank you. Thanks, Inti and Patrick and your teams for your hospitality and the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back in Manila, of course. I don't come here as much as I would like to. Last time I came here, I did at Green Papaya, I spoke a little bit about this project. I'm going to talk about the 2 books that you see here. And really it's a kind of, this is the first time that I've tried to talk about the 2 publications together. So I'm going to use this framing concept of Currencies of the Contemporary, which is the subtitle of my monograph, this one, really as a way of introducing the other one. So it's a little bit of an experiment, if you'll bear with me. So what does contemporary mean? This was one of the sort of starting points for my research when I took an academic job about 10 years ago, and I needed to come up with a funding proposal to get some money from the university to do my own research. And I had already been active as a curator and a critic for some years in the region, working with contemporary artists. And I had this problem, which was that when people say contemporary, they didn't always mean the same thing. So that, in a way, is a useful sort of starting point. I think it's probably, most of us will be aware that the discourse around contemporary art is something that has matured, you might say, or at any rate snowballed to such a point that the word contemporary, which for a very long time used to describe modern art was sometimes synonymous with the word modern, sometimes not, but in any case largely a chronological descriptor. It occurred to me that probably when that word is used now to describe the international systems of patronage and exhibition and the market and institutions and so on, when it's used to describe that system today, I think it is not just a chronological concept. Right? I think it's something else as well. It may also have a chronological connotation, but it also has something else, which I would describe as an ideological connotation. One way or another, it's a kind of value judgment. Right? That is to say, you get something from being contemporary. So what does that mean? I was interested in how in different places this happened, this becoming ideological of the term kind of happened quite differently in different places at different times, and I needed a way of analysing that. I was living in Thailand for about 5 years. From around about 2004 is when I kind of moved there sort of semi-permanently. And in that place, this was my main kind of case study. I was needing to, I suppose, define what I meant by contemporary. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'd seen on the ground there and how I dealt with it in order to make the book. There have in recent years, of course, been a lot of attempts to define contemporary or contemporaneity. To take one prominent example, Peter Osborne in his book from, I think, 2013 or thereabouts, this is one of the often cited versions of the definition of contemporaneity. He takes it from a kind of periodizing standpoint, and in one part, it's actually, I think, the introductory chapter of his book, he talks about 3 different chronologies that might lead you to this contemporaneity. One roughly post-war, post-Second World War, another that is to do with the transformations in artistic practice in the West, particularly in the 1960s, and really a tremendous sort of dilation of the formal means available to artists in the 60s. So it could be from that moment on. Or a third chronology he looks at is since 1989. Right? So the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the rapid and quite headlong internationalization of exhibitionary circuits in particular through the 90s. Now, like most definitions of the contemporary, I think Osborne's, and I'm not here to kind of, dump on Osborne. I think it's an interesting book. But like most definitions, I think contemporary is defined in relation to modern art. And I think that his way of doing that presented for me a couple of problems, working in a very different geography and with a very different even vocabulary and different languages. One problem was this: while acknowledging the global nature of contemporary art, I think Osborne's version basically leaves the Westernness of modern art intact. Right? That is to say that the kind of formal, visible, as well as discursive cues that qualified something as contemporary in his context were themselves defined in relation to Western modern art, more or less. And this was limiting from my point of view. Excuse me. A second problem is that while this was, I think a more embracing, these 3 periodizing gestures that he makes, I think is a more embracing approach than a lot of Western theory and discourse about contemporary art. I think it's still ultimately a chronological exercise, right? And that chronology is basically still a linear and progressive one. And this also wasn't necessarily what I wanted. in order to tell the story of what was happening in Thailand, which was my project. Now, in most of Southeast Asia, contemporary has been chronological as a descriptor for a very long time and is more or less coterminous as a history of usage with the modern. But then at certain points in certain places, it becomes what I've called ideological. It may also still be a period, of course, right? We might still move on at some point to something else. It has often been defined with relation to the modern, but that is not, I would suggest, not necessarily always the key kind of reference point. The main new reference point might be one's relationship to something international or transnational or perhaps global. It happens that in Southeast Asia, in most of Southeast Asia, aesthetic modernity has been historicised largely as part and parcel of a national narrative, right? For many reasons which I won't detail now. But for better or for worse, the history of modern art has largely been understood as a series of histories of national modernity. What might it mean to define the contemporary in other ways, in terms of other categories, perhaps the locality, not just nation, but also maybe region, which of course has now become one of the characteristic vocabularies that attend contemporary art in Southeast Asia is regionalism as a sort of frame for understanding the artworks made in these places. And of course the international and the global, as I said, these are spatial categories, roughly, right, that are different somehow to the spatial framework of national modernity. Today what I'm going to do is try to show how I've dealt with that shift or that problem in my work as a critic and a curator and a writer. My own approach was not to define it in the end, actually. In this book on Thai art, I didn't come up with a definition of the contemporary. Instead, what I did was, I guess, I began by accepting that there were multiple definitions of it. But I wanted to look for evidence of those multiple definitions competing. Right, so it's actually a study of the contest over the contemporary, or contests plural. I want to set this briefly also in a kind of, discursive field or a kind of landscape of discourses and disciplines, because I think this goes a long way towards explaining the shape of the publications that I'm here to share with you. Because what was at stake when I started to do this, to look for these contests over the contemporary, what was at stake was not just the category contemporary, but also the boundaries of art history itself. Right? How art is historicised more generally. And this was also something that I think was in contest and in flux as I was doing the research for these publications. One of the obvious ways in which we could see that struggle is in the divisions amongst academic research, right? So here is a very rough, and I'm famous for having the most unscientific diagrams ever, and here is one of my best. So really I'm just trying to describe, and this is not historically tied to any particular moment, but it's something that we could talk about as, roughly contemporaneous with the contemporary in the ideological sense. We've seen since the middle of the 20th century this kind of elephant in the room called cultural studies, which has to some extent transformed practically and institutionally, structurally, the way that knowledge is produced about culture and the histories of art and other forms of culture, which of course is fundamentally an anti-elitist approach to historicising culture. We see that is not really adjacent to art history. In fact, they're enemies. As someone who's trained in art history, if I go to like a cultural studies conference, I am the enemy. And often it's ne'er the twain shall meet, right? Those disciplines are not really friends. Nevertheless, they share terrain, and I would think that these kind of upstart sub-disciplines in between them would be a way of kind of generalising what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years, particularly in the last 15 or 20 years, where we start to see a lot more opportunities for people to study these subject matters through different lenses. One of them is exhibition histories. That's the kind of framework of this series of books here, in which we have one example. But also, of course, visual studies, visual culture. These are also kind of... and these, of course, are things that are kind of cannibalising art history. These are the programs that are stealing the students away from art history, and to some extent they owe a debt to cultural studies in their outlook. Also curatorial courses, which have become more and more popular and more available to people. This I think is in a way the state of the discipline. I've never been a good art historian. I don't pretend to really belong to that field, but certainly, I have an interest in it. So here's two outcomes. One of them, the book on the left, is a lot more art historical than I ever thought I could make something. And the other is at least framed as a product, as an exhibition history, and it's a book about a series of festivals, which I'll talk about afterwards, that were conducted in the north of Thailand in the 1990s. Okay, so both of these publications, I'm trying to kind of group them for today's purposes. Both could be seen as case studies in a way. The first is specifically looking at that contest over the contemporary in Thailand, and the second publication focuses on things that also took place in Thailand, but which were not necessarily a national situation, right? Which actually had a lot more regional significance and involvement. So I'll talk about the Thai art book first. To introduce this, I want to speak for a moment about, from a kind of personal, I guess it's curatorial, but a really personal experience, and that is arriving in the early 2000s. I started visiting Thailand in the late 90s, and I started going often in the early 2000s, and I moved there in 2004. What I could see around me, and this is from somebody who wanted to kind of make projects with artists, what I could see around me was three quite distinct kind of camps. And all of them had laid claim to this term contemporary art, and none of them ever talked to each other or wanted anything to do with each other, right? And I was partisan as well. Like, I attached myself to one of these groups, which made it kind of hard sometimes to do research on the others, but that's another story. And so I'll show you just in visual terms very quickly what I'm talking about here. The first little batch of slides, sorry Patrick, I think you might have seen some of these slides before. The first batch is what has been termed by art historians as Neotraditionalism. Right? And this is something that we see in many places. This, of course, is modern art, but it is modern artists who, for whom the question of somehow a local kind of tradition is to be represented and iterated in their modern or even contemporary artworks. So I've just picked a few of the really obvious kind of big ticket, famous Thai neo-traditionalists. I imagine you might have come across some of these names, but some of them maybe not. And these are a couple of the kind of obvious sorts of outcomes. There's also, these are people on these first two slides who are associated with the kind of, I guess you could say, the mafia of neo-traditionalism. They're people who became very famous and wealthy in the late 80s and then through the 90s, making work that looked like this. I think it's better if I don't describe it. This is drawing primarily on the visual, what are imagined to be visual languages of Thai Theravada Buddhism. I say imagined in the sense that in some cases they're drawing on a kind of visual art history, but in many cases they're quite novel. I also included some collection info because I think it's important to note how this stuff was patronized. It's banks, it's basically a Thai-Chinese mercantile class that had done very well out of the post-war and Cold War US military gift economy in Thailand and had cemented their kind of economic dominance by the 80s. And one of the ways that these Thai-Chinese kind of positioned themselves publicly as Thai instead of Thai-Chinese was by having stuff on the walls that was more Thai than Thai, right? So this kind of traditional sort of imagery. There were also a few interesting figures from outside of the loop of national kind of aesthetic, Thai washing. These are just two, Pratung, M. Jaron and Tawan Dachani, who have been sort of classified as famous neo-traditionalists. Both I would describe more plainly as modernist artists. Pratung was an outsider. He wasn't trained in the National Academy. Tawan was, but then went to the Rijksacademy in the Netherlands. But nevertheless, I think you can also see that there's a kind of strong commitment to the same sort of ideological trimmings, right, of national identity in this period. In Thailand, it's very easy for us to kind of analyze because you have the so-called three pillars of Thai nationalism, which is religion, nation, and king, right? And these are the things that gave the subject matter to artists working in this mode. So that's one camp. The second camp was a group of people who were really the product of the swelling middle classes of the 80s. Thailand had enjoyed very sustained economic growth. More and more people were able to train as artists. More art programs opened up, so the monopoly that Silpakorn, the National Academy, had started to wane in the 80s. And also more and more of these middle class artists had access to foreign study opportunities. And these artists came back after their studies often. That includes, I think, all of the people in this batch. And as you can see in this camp, and this will scream to many of you like contemporary art of the 90s. The people in this camp were doing something else with nation, religion, king, right? They were also working with this symbology, more or less. So people who you would probably know, some of you will definitely know Michael Shawanasai, Suti Kunawishianon, Chachai Puipia, some of them now market darlings, of course. Wasan Sitike, Manit Sri Ranish Pum. These are people whose work has been circulated in that kind of biennale boom of the 90s when Southeast Asian contemporary art started to become a lot more mobile. So these are the people who really, I suppose, prospered during that era. I would say that era kind of outlived its use-by date. These are shots from the kind of the promotional materials of the 2009 Thai Pavilion in Venice. An unmitigated disaster of a pavilion that really showed that this idiom of sort of national signage was still very much intact. It was organised by Sakarin Kruon as the curator. He's an artist who works at Silpakorn. He's a very interesting artist, actually. This was not an interesting pavilion. And I think it was clear that even in 2009, it was still possible to really put this forward as Thai contemporary art, and at least for Thailand's purposes, kind of get away with it. Although the critics were mixed. Right, so that's the second group. I would describe them as it's like a kind of ironic nationalism, ironic critiques of nation. Right. But the thing about these two groups, like on the one hand the neo-traditionalists, and on the other the kind of identity art of the 90s, even if the latter is sort of critical and ironic, it's still trading on exactly the same sort of signage, right? These are the national signage of Buddhism, religion and monarchy. Buddhism, nation and monarchy. So the flags, there's a kind of colour code that comes with it. And also a sort of, obvious stereotypes of Thai identity. I don't want to dwell on that anymore. The third camp that I thought was kind of more interesting to me, sort of emerged in the 90s as well. And these were artists who often were working with Thai imagery in one way or another. On the right you see Nawin Rawanchaikun's appropriation of the northeastern Thai and Lao fabric, the Pakalma, this checked fabric. And on the other side you have a cooking, the preparation of a cooking event by Recreate, which I imagine you're sort of more familiar with these names anyway, and a massage installation by Surasi Kusolwong. One thing that was interesting about these artists to me was that while they were still working with Thainess as subject matter to some extent, these were not the national symbols, right? These are all vernaculars. Right? So it's a more kind of, in some cases, working class cultural appropriation from working class cultures, or from a national, an obvious national cliche like massage, but one that, no national institution or royal institution or religious institution would ever want to emphasize, right? So there's already that sort of modulation going on. So this emerged in full force in the 90s. These were the artists who attained, I guess you could say, like, exit velocity, right? They became super global figures. They were in every other biennale. They were all over the world. So still trading on Thainess to some extent, but not really in such an official idiom or visual language. What came along with that was also a group of artists whose work just kind of didn't resemble Thai stuff at all. And that was particularly palpable amongst a younger generation, artists born in the 1970s, and indeed these were the artists that I was most interested in. Artists like Apichatpong, Araya Ratam Rensuk, artists like Pratya Pintong. Some of you will have come across some of these figures. If anyone wants to kind of probe these figures in Q&A, I'd be really happy to talk about them. This is really just to give us a superficial kind of visual scan of this is the third camp, right? You can see that their work just doesn't look Thai at all. And yet, it was the work that I was the most interested in. And these are the artists I wanted to work with when I made exhibitions or projects. These are the artists I wanted to write about, right? So I needed to somehow try to tell a story when it came time to, I didn't really want to write a book, maybe unconsciously for precisely this reason. But when it came time to write a book, the only way to write a book, if you want to keep your academic job, is like a national study, right? Because if you go and look at the bookshelves, they're all national studies, right? Nobody really makes books about anything other than national studies of art history. So I thought, okay, well, I got to figure out some way to do it without hating myself. And so I had to try to reconcile these three camps, right? And so this is where the idea of a contest sort of came from. All of these three camps, with their separate kind of patronage networks and their separate sort of social networks and whatever, all had a claim, all had laid claim to the contemporary. Right? So how can we kind of tell a story? I didn't want to really be inclusive of all of these artists, but how can we tell a story that somehow explains their relationship? Right? That was very much the kind of problem that I tried to tackle with that book. Okay, so I got down to thinking like I'm going to need some way of analysing these different claims to contemporaneity, and the way I came up with, it's by no means a methodology, it's like my kind of, like a jeepney solution, right? I just kind of came up with a way on the spot, and it was to think about the currencies that these artists are each trading, right? To think about it in a slightly economic sense, right? What are the currencies that these respective groups of artists are, trafficking in their exchanges with a wider world? So the connection to the international, I think, is very important. It's worth underscoring as well that all three of these groups had a claim to international circulation and international exposure and opportunities, right? It's not like the Neotraditionalists were just making work for Thailand. That was the core of their patronage, but they were also receiving accolades in international forums. So I think that's kind of important. All three travelled, so to speak. So I started to think, like, what are the currencies that these various groups of artists are wielding in trying to make careers for themselves? So what I mean by currencies could be lots of different things. It could be things that you would attach more to the artwork as a physical thing, or as a legal thing, or to perhaps history, right? How do you connect what you're doing as a contemporary artist to the art that has come before? It could be things that you might describe as contextual, like what debates or issues are you connecting your work with, how are you framing your practice, as they say these days in art schools. And really that's a set of discursive currencies, right? What are the buzzwords that you're dropping in your pitch to a curator or in trying to sell something to a collector? What are the things that the words and the discourses that you want to kind of marshal in order to be successful in contemporary art? And so this is really just a kind of, this isn't by no means exhaustive, right? This is just a kind of flashcard of some of the things that I was thinking about. And some of them, of course, cross these categories as well. So formal things like, these were various times in art's history, it's been important to actually look at artworks and, describe them visually. Things like your connections, things like your pedigree, what school you went to, who your teacher was, these kinds of things. Or even one's independence from those sorts of networks, that's sometimes also valued. And then, the discursive ones, it just kind of goes on and on, of course. I'm going to show a couple of pictures now that I think just kind of give a quick example of one of those, and it's a study that I do in the book in one chapter, which is about mobility, and it allows me then to sort of say a few words about this. I think it's a very important currency that artists started to accumulate in great measure in the 1990s that the artists of previous decades had not been able to get access to. There's a story that I tell in the book about this figure who you see with the scooter in the middle, Inson Wongsam. He's a Thai modernist, a very interesting artist, but somebody who, like most of his generation, would not have had access to international opportunities were it not for his association with the National Academy and its founder, who was an Italian chap. This is said Italian chap here, Faraci, also known as Corrado Faraci, who set up the National Academy in the 1930s and 40s. Now, what Faraci would do with his class favourites is give them access to a kind of travel scholarship of sorts, basically by recommending them to receive some kind of diploma money, usually to go and study in Rome. He was basically a Milan-based artist, but he was connected in the Italian academic system, so he made opportunities in the 40s and 50s available to artists who he thought showed the most potential. So travel, international travel, was a key ingredient of artistic success, even at the beginnings of modern art in Thailand, right? It's always been there. And this set the kind of pattern from the 40s, and that they didn't all go to Italy. By the 60s, quite a lot were going to the United States and the United Kingdom. But we know this geography, right? I think it's maybe slightly different geography for people in the Philippines, but we know this pattern. In order to get experience, in order to discover the world, in order to upgrade their skills as artists, and most of them went to do some kind of academic training elsewhere. This I describe in the book as the round trip itinerary, right? Because basically they all end up back in Thailand. Some of them take a long time, and Inson is interesting because he took like 12 years to come back. And so he was a hero then for other artists, including Nawin Rawanchaikun, who turned Inson's life into a kind of long-running art project, contemporary art project. And as you can already see from the destinations that appear on this slide, Nawin's project, kind of celebrating the life of Inson, it was called Fly With Me to Another World, took him to all of the hippest and most happening sites in global contemporary art in the 90s and the early 2000s. But what was interesting was that Nawin's trajectory was not a round trip at all. Nawin created for himself a totally international practice and career. He married a Japanese person and had a child with her. He was from just globetrotting constantly for years and years. He was one of the most mobile artists of the 90s, certainly in the early 2000s. Rikrit Tirawanit, who I guess needs no introduction, although he's not quite a Thai artist, I think definitely deserves a place in this story. He is the most quintessentially nomadic kind of pin-up poster child for global contemporary art. He based himself in 3 or 4 different cities. He was constantly on the move. And he indeed, I think you could say, kind of thematized that mobility in many of his installations as well. So really this is, again, just to give us a sort of superficial gloss on what mobility meant. So what I was interested in was, in the case of mobility, for example, what currency do you actually get from doing these travels? Right? And so I look in that chapter at the very different experiences and the very different rewards that the round trip generations got compared to what I consider to be the kind of global generation, whose trajectory, I would say, is orbital, definitely not a round trip. Okay, so that's one sort of quick example. Other currencies that were really important, that were sort of unavoidable for me, the contemporary itself, right? The word contemporary, and how one was able to kind of smuggle oneself into other contemporaries, other scenes or other countries or other kind of networks. The curatorial was a really important one, and of course I was drawing heavily, liberally on Patrick's work, Patrick having identified, I think, a really crucial moment where contemporaneity started to be defined, or at least qualified, in terms of a new figure, a new professional figure on the landscape. There had been organisers and exhibition makers, of course, forever, but there hadn't been many self-identified curators in this landscape. And Patrick's study of the emergence of those figures, all of whom, not incidentally, were trained as artists, but who gravitated towards that sort of more discursive role in the kind of 70s and 80s, and who by the 90s had become important gatekeepers of at least their national scenes, but in some cases also transnational gatekeepers. Nation, of course, also could not be set aside, right? A lot of these artists were still making work about their national experience. It may have been the visual sort of vocabulary had clearly changed, right? But that doesn't mean that their national experience or national histories or cultures weren't an important part of their thinking or their work. And then, of course, the international. This was another currency that I couldn't neglect. And what does international mean? There's one part of the book where I look very specifically at what it has meant to be international as a Thai artist, and what that has meant over time, and how that sort of articulates a bigger cultural shift where Thailand, by the 90s, had started to see itself as valid on the world stage by way of the kind of export of prized cultural furniture, right? So the export of Thainess in a kind of world-class product, whether that was in performing arts or whether that was in cultural heritage or whether that was in contemporary art, had become a kind of middle-class fascination and a kind of point of considerable national pride. Now, these are the currencies that I think were really most determinant in buying one's entry into a global scenario or circuit. How does an artist's international mobility, for example, determine their prospects and the reception of their work? These are the sorts of things I was interested in. This is never simply a matter of degrees of international success, right? It's also to do with how that international experience can be parlayed into some kind of standing or stature in the national scene, right? So, of course, being international is not really worth anything for the international people, right? If you're international, that's a currency that you only have in your national kind of frame, right? In your national context. To be international actually means something. Okay, so I'll move on. I want to give one more kind of case study or quick example, and then I think maybe it'll be time to switch to Q&A. Does anybody want to ask questions or make comments at this stage? I'm very happy to be interrupted. No? Okay. I'll just keep going. Okay, so another little, if you like, a little vignette from this process of me kind of looking at currencies. I was by this stage starting to become mobile myself. So the mobility of the curator is a really important parameter here. The reason I was mobile was mainly because I got very interested in video. And as most of you know, video is a very portable thing, and this was the period, the early 2000s, where the kind of portability of digital video work was sort of becoming very obvious to organisers and art showing platforms all over the place. And it was very easy to get a gig if you didn't have any physical artworks to carry, right? So I made a couple of survey programs really of Thai and then Southeast Asian video work in various different contexts, and that helped me actually to start to see Thai art in these other places, right? Without that I wouldn't have known what was going on really, because it's very hard to get printed documentation or printed, there's no criticism in Thailand or very little, particularly in those days. It was really hard to know what was going on, but I started to travel. I started to see stuff elsewhere. This is one of the kind of, from this period in the kind of the 2000s, the noughties or whatever you call them. This was one of the greatest triumphs of Thai contemporary art, the first ever Thai artist to exhibit in Documenta. And this is Sakarin, who I mentioned earlier. He was in Documenta 12. Now, what's interesting there were many things that were interesting about this work. Some of you might have seen this work, but you might not know that the work was also returned, so to speak, to Thailand. It was exhibited in a gallery, actually a commercial gallery, on the outskirts of Bangkok in the following year. And I was lucky to have been abreast of both. I didn't actually physically go I went to Documenta, but I got lost trying to find the chateau, and I had to go to the airport, and I was driving myself, and this is in the days before like roaming and Google Maps and stuff, so I just had to abort, and I went to the airport. But I was involved in the catalogue that they made for this project, and so I knew the project inside out. And I also saw the return exhibition. And so this was one of the good examples where I had of, if you like, not a single artwork maybe, but a single project that had sort of been through both sides, right? That had been sort of processed on both sides of that divide, and I managed to see what they'd done with it in the two contexts, in Bangkok versus Kassel. And so this became kind of an important, one of the first case studies that I really got stuck into in the book, because they were totally different projects in the two places. So I'll just mention briefly what that difference was. So in Kassel, Sakharin made this enormous terraced contraption in the front of the Schloss. This is Schloss Wilhelmshöhe, which is like the main castle of the region that Kassel is in, and it's now a museum, as it has an art collection as well as other things. It's a tourist site. It had to be largely reconstructed, I think, after the Second World War, and it now is a kind of piece of the civic furniture, right? It's a kind of I think nationally as well as state-funded museum. And it's very often one of the venues for Documenta, which of course is one of the most high-profile recurring contemporary art surveys in the world, set up in 1955. Okay, so what he did there was basically like land art, right? It was a totally monumental gesture. It was very site-specific in the sense that, it was about this kind of transplanting of a Thai, or at least Southeast Asian, mode of agricultural production into this highly industrialized economy, so across kind of the sensible bounds of like species geographies as well as climate, and also across economic history, right? So, there's not much agricultural production. Kassel was an important industrial city for a long time. There's not terribly much agriculture there, and certainly the vast majority of the population of Hesse, or however you want to frame Documenta, are not farmers and don't have very much to do with farms. So this is kind of the other thing that was important about the project, it was framed discursively. The discursive currency was all about collaboration and anti-capitalism, right? And these modes of farming, of course, were associated with Thai traditions. Sakharin is from Mehongson, actually, from the north. This is a style of farming that happens there. It happens in other places as well. And he brought specialists who are, farm irrigating specialists from Thailand to come and help. The project practically completely failed. They couldn't get the hillside to stay together. And so they had to sort of redo the system completely and distribute the water in a completely different way. They basically had to improvise. And although Documenta raised a tremendous sum to fund this, it was a very expensive thing to do, obviously. Documenta raised a lot of money for it. The artist rejected the funding. I think it was somewhere in the order of €1 million. And the artist made a big point about not taking the money. And the reason was that he wanted the project to be realised through a form of labour, a labour structure that was not market mediated, right? That was not mediated through money and capital. Right? He wanted the project to be realised through friends helping each other. Right? So a highly idealistic and you could say romantic kind of approach to making a big art project. And so you see images of the Thais working with, kind of German retirees and backpackers sometimes, and they eventually sort of made it happen. They didn't yield terribly much rice. The German summer was not especially friendly to them, but nevertheless they got enough. Some of the rice went into an interior exhibit space, and was given away as gifts to visitors. Just a little bag of rice grains. And then some of the grains were taken back to Thailand. They were sown in a plot in Ratburi, which is where the artist now kind of lives most of the time. and then re-sewn in the exhibition that I mentioned in Bangkok, right? So he kept the strain going, if you like, and made the project again in Thailand with the same genes. When he did the show in Bangkok, it was in this kind of outer suburban gallery, which is run by a very powerful professor at the time at Silpakorn, one of his colleagues, who's also a very successful businessman running art galleries. And the project, the rice was sown in a diminutive plot just in front of the gallery, which is then overlooking a 8 or 10 lane freeway and traffic, and basically it was more or less invisible. And there were events there at some points. They also did like all of the research from the project was installed in the inside, the interior space of the gallery there. And they also had a live web link for some reason, which still escapes me, to some other exhibitions that he had on at the same time off the back of this Documenta success in downtown Bangkok. Right? So it was a very multiform thing. The important thing for our purposes here is that this project was utterly, utterly transformed in the process. And ironically, what he took to Kassel was kind of like a, you know, almost like a kind of capital M modernist statement of land art, right? Monumental, kind of non-discursive, there's no words anywhere, you know, totally idealistic and romantic and you know, with lashings of this kind of ideological dressing of you know, freedom of collaboration. Freedom and collaboration, and escaping the market, escaping capitalism. The project that you saw in Bangkok, ironically, just stank of Documenta, right? It was full of documentation, it had text everywhere, there were like diagrams on the floor, there was new media. I mean, it was just like literally you could not have dreamed up more of a cliche of what a Southeast Asian artist thinks is a Documenta style work, right? But that was shown in Bangkok, right, for the Thai audience primarily, almost entirely for a Thai audience. Right, so I became interested in this exchange. What it showed me was that the currencies that made an artist contemporary, and Documenta is an unimpeachably contemporary institution, of course, what made the artwork or the project contemporary in these two places was an utterly different set of currencies, right? And so this, I think, is just one really stark example of how that was so. The coda to that is that some of you will know that in the late 90s, this project, the Land Foundation, was established in the north of Thailand, in Chiang Mai, by a few artists who shared a lot of this kind of ideological ambition, who basically purchased a piece of land outside of Chiang Mai. So we're talking like maybe 8 hours drive from Bangkok. Really in the rice fields, in the villages, that they proposed to hold in commons, right? Not as a piece of property, but which would be cultivated by the villagers mainly, and anyone else who happened to be around to help, around which they built a series of structures which were made to be to function as kind of artist residency spaces or meditation huts. In fact, all of them are kind of serve the purpose of, you know, meditation and yoga and solitude, as well as a place to live, right? So the Land Foundation had become already, by the 2000s, a bona fide kind of like trophy project for the acolytes of Nicolas Bourriaud's relational aesthetics, which was a very powerful discourse for a while in basically, again, trying to shift this old modernist project of trying to shift the valuing of art, or the value of art, away from the object, away from the production of commodities, away from the museum, away from galleries, right? This is another in that lineage. But the difference in Bourriaud's case, I guess, is that he sort of theorized from this that there had been a new way of doing this, a new turn that was what he called relational. That is to say that the purpose of art, or the purpose of good art, now had become the production of new kinds of social relationships. And so you might look at the relationship here between the artists and the local villagers as a kind of exemplary project in that regard. And it indeed was exemplary. Burio went, Claire Bishop, who is relational aesthetics' most strident critic, also made a pilgrimage to the Land Foundation, in due diligence, I imagine, and she came off, pretty soft on. She was very gentle on the Land Foundation. She kind of liked the place. She enjoyed having been in these new Asian cities with all these new shiny private museums going up and stuff. I think she enjoyed the decrepitude of the place. It's sort of rotting into most of the huts are rotting into the rice fields. I was interested in this. This was also a great case study for me because it showed the whole spectrum, right? That this space could be, on the one hand, a really valuable drop-in centre for local kids. The artists in Chiang Mai would go there. They didn't have to make an appointment. They could basically just show up and hang out and even live there for a while if they wanted to, as a space to think, right? And not really to have to produce something, but as a space to meet and to think. And I think the Land Foundation has been used for precisely that on a local level, right? So there's a certain sort of currency that comes with the artist-run initiative doing that. Then there was this absolutely global currency that came from Burio and Hans Ulrich Obrist and all these kind of superstar curators who would come, for a kind of getaway. I mean, it's like a kind of, sort of like an ashram. You come, but very quick sort of visit, right? Where you might have a barbecue and eat some good food, and then they'd set some lanterns flying in the sky, and then you go back to your hotel, right? So it managed to perform these functions really well at both ends of the spectrum. In the middle of that spectrum, of course, is the poor old nation state, right? And in the national context, these projects have an extremely fraught and, for me, very uncomfortable kind of currency. They are trading on the renovation of a very, very old form of the power of representation of power, right? And in most of Southeast Asia we have this, and that is that the monarch associates himself with rice, right, and with agriculture, because the well-being of the society is really founded upon pulling things out of the ground and eating them, and that needs to be the kind of the key sort of symbol of sovereignty, actually. Now in Thailand has its own version of this story. I won't go into details, but that has become a very awkward inheritance, precisely because of some of you will know, the resurgence of monarchic power in recent memory. Thailand, while the rest of Southeast Asia has kind of been a poster child for global neoliberalism and moving towards a sort of more market-oriented ethics, in fact, Thailand has gone in precisely the opposite direction over the last 20 years, and even more. In 1958, the dictator who was installed that year, Sarit Thanarat, was the first dictator. This is since Thailand had a revolution in 1932, where absolute monarchy was abolished. And that was the case. There was no absolute monarch until the 50s, and in the 50s even there wasn't an absolute monarch, but the dictators in the late 50s decided we cannot hold this country together without the monarchy, right? That they came to the conclusion that it was necessary to have the monarchy for the purposes of building some kind of national identity and sympathy, and so they began gradually to restore the symbolic capital and standing of the palace. What we're seeing now in Thailand's epically dysfunctional polity in the last 20 years is the fruits of that investment, right? Now, Thailand's main political dispute is between people who feel like the king is basically a god figure, and people who feel like the king is just a person and shouldn't really be the richest person on the planet. And so this has been unfolding in all sorts of horrible, ugly ways in Thailand, and the period that I lived in Thailand and was there a lot was sort of really like ground zero for this conflict. Some of you will know the story of Thaksin Shinawatra, who came to power in the late 90s and was the Prime Minister in the early 2000s before he was unceremoniously dumped by military coup, of course, in 2006. Thaksin was interesting for many reasons, but one of them was that he was the first ever Prime Minister who did not enjoy the backing of the army. Right? And this was historically very significant, and this indeed was the seeds of his real challenge, which was not quite political but more symbolic. Right? He was the first person who didn't enjoy the whole kind of armature of symbolic power that the monarchy had rebuilt in cahoots with the generals. Right? And those of you who know Thailand's history will know that is an ongoing saga. So this is interesting. In the 2000s, the late 90s and then early 2000s, we have this situation where somebody else has come along who has laid claim to the same symbolic terrain as the monarchy. That's the first real challenge. This is Thaksin. He did it by pumping money into the provinces. This is exactly what the palace had been doing for the last 30 years. Right? Is systematically flooding money into the far-reaching capillaries of the state, mainly at village level, in things like, village development, right? So some money so that you can buy a fence to put around your chickens, buying bicycles so kids could get to school because it was too expensive to build a road. These kinds of very grassroots level things. This is what the palace had very assiduously patronised for decades. Thaksin did the same thing through the arms of government. He basically put money into the tumbons, the village level administrations. And as a result, he was mounting the first really significant political challenge to monarchic military power. And this is indeed why he's been sort of chased out and why all of his family have been sort of persecuted ever since. So the symbolism of agriculture was obviously something that I had to tackle, right? Because it gave you these three levels. This symbolism had some resonance at the local level, it had some resonance at the national level, it had some resonance regionally as well, and it had some resonance for these global kind of globe-trotting curator figures. And so it was obviously one that I had to tackle, and so in one of the chapters I go there. Now, before I finish, I really have to wrap up, but before I finish, I just want to say that is kind of a prelude to the second publication, because what I hadn't done, basically my study in this book was about what happened after the financial crisis. That was, loosely speaking, the chronological frame of the book. And it had always irked me that so much interesting stuff had happened in the early 90s and in the 80s that I knew was relevant to these stories, but which I didn't really have room to kind of pursue properly. I don't really want to continue with showing pictures so much, but I was approached many years ago by the publishers of this series of exhibition histories. After all, they run a journal mainly out of London, but they are also kind of globalizing what they do. And they wanted to do a book on something from Asia. And for years and years, I rejected that. I said, you can't do this in Southeast Asia. Because the books had a certain sort of format, they had a certain kind of structure, and it was heavily dependent on written discourse. It was heavily dependent on criticism. So you had in the front some sort of framing essays that were about the significance of whatever exhibition they'd chosen, Magicien de la Terre, the third Havana Biennial. These are kind of some of the important shows they started with. And it was about sort of the post-89 moment. And then there would be a section where the exhibition was kind of, where you got like a fly-through, like what an architect does with CAD, right? To show you, fly through the CAD so you can see like what was where. And they did it in print, right? So you could see photographed installation views of like what work was sitting next to what, and this was pretty heavily annotated in most cases. Right, so there's a kind of running commentary. Then you turn the corner and you saw X, right? So there was that, and then there was a section which was about the kind of, often about the critical debates, right? So they would have republishing a critique written for Art Forum International or for Flash Art or whatever that were contemporaneous with the exhibition usually, right? So I just said to them, you can't do this in Southeast Asia. First of all, we don't have that density of written, like really good written material on any exhibition. Secondly, I think you'd struggle to find an exhibition that was significant enough to do it to, right? This was my kind of like brushing them off way of telling them no. And they sort of eventually prevailed upon me to do it, and what I suggested they could try to do is Chiang Mai Social Installation. This is a series of festivals that happened in Chiang Mai from 92 to 98. There were 4 editions of the festival, but there was also a kind of spin-off event that happened 3 times called the Weeks of Cooperative Suffering. And this publication, which I won't talk about in much detail, was basically an attempt to kind of ask that question, what would you do instead? If you can't do that kind of exhibition history, and I really like the books, like I really like that series, and they're so useful for teaching as well. They're like source books, right? So that you get a really fine-grained, multi-perspectival take on an event, on some object, usually a large exhibition, right? From a lot of angles, and over time, like historically sort of conscious as well. And so if you can't do it quite like that, then what would you do? You have to deal with the fact that a lot of these stories haven't been written down, for example. So we needed to do a kind of quasi-ethnographic job here. You have to deal with the fact that archives don't really have the same, or don't function in the same ways in this part of the world. They're, for example, very hard to keep physically, therefore they're usually less accessible. They need to be narrated in a way that I think archives, in a more kind of systematic archiving culture or more literary culture, sort of has systems for, that we, in many places in Southeast Asia, I won't say all, have largely lack. How do you deal with the fact that a lot of these artists are heavily implicated in mafia structures in art institutions today? How does that kind of occlude or obscure certain parts of the story? There are a lot of these sort of traps, I felt, and so coming up with an approach to that was its own adventure. I'm very happy to say that we managed to prevail upon Patrick Flores to produce an exhilarating essay for the volume, and hopefully I'll now get to interview him about that a little bit. But in any case, I guess there's just 2 things that I want to underscore about this series of festivals. One of them is that it was clear to me that this was a very important site for the generation of currencies of the contemporary, if I may now use that phrase. This was obviously an important site for that. Those currencies were transnational in their origins and their points of reference. They were contemporary in a lot of the ways that a much wider geography of contemporary art was being contemporary. So that was one thing. It was obvious that this was a place where I should have looked in my own book, but hadn't had the wherewithal to look. The second thing I just want to underscore is that I'll tell a brief anecdote about the process. When I moved to Thailand, properly in the early 2000s, I started talking to people because I wanted to know what was going on in Thai art practice. I wanted to know what was important to people. I wanted to know what was significant in their memories. And I asked them about the past, and a lot of them would kind of look at me and go, like, why are you asking about the past? It was like, I come from a kind of literary culture. We think about the past and we try to, find out about it. And then they would tell me their stories about, what brought them to the present. Many of them, I would say most of them, mentioned this series of festivals. Right, so it was already intriguing to me, like, why was this set of festivals important? After 10 years of that, I felt that I kind of knew what was important about this festival. I kind of had a picture of what the festivals looked like. I'd been to many of the places where the festivals happen. I had talked to many of the people involved. And I talked to people who were principals, like organisers. I talked to people who were participants, including some from other countries who had been there in the 90s to participate in these festivals. I talked to artists who hadn't participated at all, but who remembered them, either because they were there or just because of the excitement that they generated. They learned about what was happening in Chiang Mai. And I felt after 10 or 12 years, I had a pretty good sense of what they were all about, right? And that was sort of enough for me for a long time. And when this project came up, the book project came up, I started to think about that, and I realised that having talked to all of those people about this common object, not one of them had ever mentioned an artwork. Literally not one. And so I started to think, well, what kind of an art history have I got here, right? I don't even know if art is the thing that we're historicising, right? And this was also, I think, a very important and valuable, like in some ways exciting kind of proposition for somebody who's jaded about art history. Like, what ought to be the object of our studies? You know, this I think is a question we sometimes don't ask, and we probably should be asking. I think the tentative conclusion that I come to in my own contribution, which is just one essay in this book, is that it's the sociality itself. It was the gathering that was important. I don't think it was art. I mean, another thing that was a quirk of Southeast Asian sort of 90s exhibition history, only one of the works in these festivals, in 4 festivals, I'm talking about hundreds of artists and works from dozens of countries, there was only one work that I've come across in the archives so far that has entered a collection. Only one. Right? So that gives you an indication of just how little will have been written about these artworks, right? Pretty much nil in the vast majority of cases, right? So what is there to historicise? What am I supposed to be looking for here? And if the story that I wanted to tell was about regionalism, it was about the moment when artists started to share a contemporaneity that one could call regional, then, you know, what was the stuff of that? What was the raw material of that contemporaneity? It wasn't artworks, I would think. It wasn't artworks. Artworks were an important kind of language for articulating that contemporaneity, but I don't think that the history needs to be artwork-centric. It certainly shouldn't be object-centric. Right? So this is just a couple of teasers, I guess, for, you know, what we were up against and what we tried to do. I think I've talked enough, so thank you all very much for patiently hearing me out. Do you want to take the...
Yeah, a few questions from me and then I just...
Sure, that would be great.
So thank you. Thank you. Thank you, David, for the very insightful talk. You identified some competing claims to the contemporary in Thailand, right? You identified the neo-traditional, the identitarian, I think. The second one, you might want to cast it that way, and the vernacular. I was interested in the articulation of those claims. How were those claims articulated? Were they articulated discursively in writing, or did you, like, as a student of the forms, did you, like, try to define the claim based on the material you saw in Thailand? So I'm interested in the articulation of the claim.
Yeah, it's really different across the three sort of camps. I would say that in the case of neo-traditionalists, it was articulated institutionally. Right, very few of these artists wrote very much, and the texts on the record about these artists' practice leave a little to be desired from a kind of critical art historical perspective. Typically, where that sort of art had been claimed as contemporary, was in it's being instrumentalized by powerful institutions. So a couple of examples would be Silpakorn and the network of kind of patronage that it controls. So for example, Silpakorn up until, still, but historically always controlled the national prize, right? They have a national artist system, as you do here, and Silpakorn is the institution that has controlled that. They control access to commissions, lucrative government public artwork commissions, or entry into, sometimes even into international exhibition opportunities. They control the syllabus at the art school. So it means that when you enroll to study art, one of the things you can choose is traditional art, right? Thai traditional art. It's a complicated institutional history, but that would be, I would say, for the neo-traditionalists, the main way. This doesn't just mean domestically. The image that I showed of the Wat Buddhapadip temple in London, which was made by a gang of neo-traditionalist artists who went to London over a period of 8 years, which was launched, it was finished in the early 90s, to decorate the Ubosot, the ordination hall of this Thai Buddhist temple in London. And there's a book written about this mural project by an anthropologist called Sandra Kate. And this is one of the important studies of contemporaneity in the Thai context, where she looks in detail at some of the patronage networks that made this possible. So that marshalled government support, the Sangha, the clergy, as well as like certain sects, very moneyed sects within Buddhism, as well as corporate and even private, individual sponsorship, right? So these people wanted contemporary art. That's why you see these kind of pop art figures appearing in these. Not in this shot, but this looks a bit more traditional than it actually is. There's parts of it by other artists where you have like Superman and Mao Zedong and like all these other kind of figures. It's really contemporary in that sense. It's modern art. It's definitely not anything other than modern art. But I think it's mainly, broadly speaking, institutionally articulated, right? So where does the money come from? Who promotes a project? Who are the people facilitating it, often socially as well? Contemporaneity for what you've called the identitarian batch, and I think that's a good description for them, starts to be a lot more internationally articulated. So whether you're contemporary in international eyes or not is a distinguishing feature here. So these are people who got access to more foreign education and then the network of residencies and contemporary art exhibition opportunities. For them, often their contemporaneity, I think, went without saying. So often I think it wasn't really articulated, but through the kinds of distinctions that they like to draw between themselves and these neo-traditionalists, because it was also a political distinction, but they didn't want to be apologists for this, national window dressing, is also, I think, a claim for something other than the contemporary that the neo-traditionalists represented, right? And they didn't have the same backing, institutionally speaking. When it comes to the third group, by this stage, I think you could say that people were deliberately not wanting national patronage, right? So artists like Arin Rungjang and Pratya Pintong, two of the artists in this little quick summary, for example, whose work doesn't look at all Thai. Both of them were making works about Thailand. Both of these works, for example, are about Thai people and Thai stuff. But they're not visibly Thai in any way. These artists deliberately ran away from national institutional patronage and even from the market, like the local, what little local market Thailand had at the time in the 2000s. I mean, Thailand even now has kind of like 3 collectors, right? So, and then there's now a new generation starting to become more interesting, but in those days it was impossible to sell works if you weren't, making something to go above the couch. So these artists they were fortunate, they had a lot of sort of qualifying opportunities abroad, and they were content with that. So throughout the 2000s, they had nothing to do with Thai contemporary art in Thailand. They didn't exhibit in these places very much or tried to avoid it. Every now and then, one of their professors would say, "Oh, come on, be in this group show at Silpakorn," and they would go, "Okay, I guess I better." But basically they didn't want anything to do with the local art firmament. That's not to say that they weren't locally engaged. They all were, tremendously, but they didn't want anything to do with the institutions or the kind of corridors of power in that landscape. Unfortunately for them, their work was qualified as contemporary by this international system on which they became very, very mobile and successful. Interestingly, these two artists that I picked, they funded their life as artists by selling T-shirts. Right, so there's also a kind of economic dimension here. They probably could have been professionalised contemporary artists full-time in Europe, but these two, for example, decided they wanted to be based in Thailand. They lived in Bangkok. They wanted their work to come out of that experience, and they sold T-shirts for 10 years in order to fund their practice.
But I was wondering, David, if there had been crossover artists across the three camps, no? If the borders between them were more porous, that artists could actually, weave in and out of those circuits. Did you ever think of? Was there some kind of a case, an artist who was able to do that, or were these in silos, very almost sealed hermetically? I don't know. What do you think?
My overall summary answer would be that they're more or less worlds unto themselves. But there aren't cases that I can readily think of where there was successful crossover or kind of cohabitation across those boundaries. But there were many cases I can think of where kind of, what's the word? An overture was made across those things. So between the third batch and the first batch, sometimes there is interest, right? The neo-trads are not all as boring as I make them sound.
It's because
Sakharin is one very good, but I don't think it's really possible to occupy both camps. He was trained as a neo-traditionalist.
Yeah.
He was trained in traditional Thai mural art. But in his international contemporary practice, he's only a couple of times really shown that. So Documenta was one. He also did a painting installation in Documenta. And there are a couple of other exhibitions where he's done it. But by and large, he's shown something that formally is very, very distinct from neo-traditionalism. I've also seen a lot of cases where artists of the second and third camps have made a deliberate overture towards Silpakorn, for one reason or another. Surasi Kusalwong, who's absolutely part of the third camp and one of the leaders, the pioneers of it, was trained at Silpakorn. He went to art school there, and then he became a very successful artist in Europe in particular, but also in this kind of Biennale circuit. He started at one point teaching at Silpakorn, so sometimes they would sort of go back to the fold and see what they could make of it, usually in an attempt to try to change it, right? To try to drag the National Art Academy into the present, which, as we know in many places, is a very hard thing to do. There are many cases where people have tried. As far as I know, they almost always fail.
Yeah. And maybe, I'm sure the members of the audience have a question. So this is my last question about method. I was wondering if there was, because the main category of your work is currency, right? If there was another category that you were thinking of to define the contemporary, as you were working on the material. So that's one, and maybe related to that is, were you ever tempted to do a comparative study I mean, owing to the fact that the contemporary sort of demands the comparative, and you were working on the category of the Thai, of Thai as a category which is strongly linked to the local or the national. So was there any attempt on your part to move beyond that category of Thainess or whatever, to fully flesh out your desire to explicate the contemporary, methodologically?
Yeah, I mean, to the first part first. Currencies, as I said, it's not a method. It's kind of ad hoc. And yes, there were other things, not really formal things, not things that would take me closer to a kind of iconographical or formal encounter. I mean, there's some pretty hand-to-hand combat in the book with artworks. I like writing about artworks, but I'm not really interested in formally derived vocabularies of art history, because for me that vocabulary comes with such a heavily loaded non-Asian baggage, right? And I just wanted to, I guess in a way, sort of launder my method of that. I was trained in that tradition. I was trained in basically Marxist social history of art. And it had, I think more interesting inflections than I maybe give it credit for, but it was fundamentally still tied to the object, right? And I was very conscious that the artists that I was most interested in were moving away from physical objects in their practice. They were post-studio artists, you could say. And so I didn't want there to be formal or iconographical sort of threads through the book. I wanted to try to get as far from that as I could. The other thing that occurred to me to mention is that it does in a way end up being a kind of social history of art or an institutional history, one way or another. Yeah, sociology is a strong word for me, but it moves in that direction. And I would say that maybe the best sort of outlet that doesn't quite go there is like the international. To study what it meant to be international in historical perspective was really revealing to me, and was not something that I'd sort of seen coming when I started to try to make this into a book. That brings me to the second question. Yes, I've always been tempted to do comparative studies. When I started to become more mobile within Southeast Asia myself, I was immediately struck by the resonances and the differences amongst the kind of various national scenes. I definitely didn't want to do a national study, and I definitely didn't want to write a book, actually. But I was too late in the process of being a university employee. I realized that actually getting job security there would be a very good thing. And it was at that time that I sort of got my act together and pitched a book, and was very lucky to get a good publisher to do it. So yes, there always have been comparative things. And in some of my curatorial work, I think I've been much more able to articulate that. This is also this is where my work is kind of headed now. I having done the kind of national book, I don't ever have to do it again. I've got job security, so if my next book is a flop, it doesn't really matter. I really now have more latitude, I think, to do that. And what I'm interested in the moment is histories of regionalism, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean Asian ones, but ones that somehow involve Asia. I've started to think recently, what would it do to art history if the central kind of ethical and aesthetic principles that we rebound between were derived from a Pacific axis instead of a North Atlantic one? What would that do to our field? And this is very early stages of a new project, but that's kind of where I'm heading. And that, of course, doesn't just involve Asia. That's also a sprawling geography that is immediately implicated in that question. So I'm starting to look at histories of sort of errant modernism that might tell that story in an interesting way. Also, the history of the Curator. You'd be happy to know I'm sort of revisiting this terrain. because I think that this is also a figure that deserves more scrutiny. You know, and I think the historicity of the curatorial function has not really been fleshed out in writing very much, and so that's another thing I'd like to do.
Okay, so thank you. So I think we have time for questions from the floor. So the floor is now open for questions. It's a small room, so just project your points the way David does, and we can hear each other, I'm sure. So anyone, please. Okay. Question?
David,
Maria.
Since we're talking about artists, could you maybe talk about one more artist? I was curious about how Korakrit Chai's practice registers in Thailand.
This is one of the people one of the artists who has gone across these barriers, right? Korakrit is absolutely from the third camp, if you use my kind of crude divisions. He's an artist whose professional becoming happened outside of Thailand almost entirely. When he was in Thailand, I think he still was trying to become a rock star, right?
Was he born in Thailand?
Yeah. He's not like Rikrit, he's not like totally a kind of Diplo kid, but his art professionalization was entirely in the United States. His practice, I think, speaks very easily to the most current strands of international contemporary, like it-kid contemporary art. Often, post-internet art, so-called, is one of these strands, and he's front and center in that kind of scene. He's trying really carefully, I think, and in a very intelligent way to engage with his national baggage, to pick up some of his national baggage which he had shed in more recent works, I think. He's going really back to the Neotraditionalists in some of those videos. In one in particular, he's looking closely not so much at the artworks, but at the figure of Chalum Chai Kozit Pipat, whose work you see here, who is a kind of superstar artist in Thailand. I mean, it's hard to imagine what that would look like, but he has TV shows. He's like a personality, right? And he is this, classically kind of priapic modernist man artist, right? Who is all about the kind of the presence and charisma, physicality, the hand of the artist, the trace of the physical body of the artist is very important in his work. He is an absolute walking cliche of modernism, right? And he has become very successful as a neo-traditionalist, painting these kind of, namby-pamby, kind of nice-looking, pastel-y sort of pictures of angels floating around in the clouds, right? As well as a lot of other stuff. He's famous for making a very ornate temple in Chiang Mai, where he's from. He's a really interesting figure. He's a very talented artist. I think his work deserves to be looked at historically, but he's worlds apart from international contemporary art, right? Worlds apart. And so I think it's really interesting that Korakrit is very deliberately kind of picking a figure like this to try to sort of, if you like, discover his own role and persona in a national context. Obviously, he knows that this is a completely antithetical sort of professional model. But nevertheless, he knows that he's somehow connected to that person in a tradition of sorts, and he's trying to do that. I think he's one to watch. I think he's had completely inordinate amounts of success and praise heaped on him. I mean, the guy's barely made any works, and he'd probably admit that himself, right? He's very, very young. He hasn't done terribly much, but he's clearly someone with great potential.
And he's also curating now.
Yeah, he's also an organizer and a curator. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, David.
Hi.
Can you talk a bit about the feedback of your book in Thailand? What has the artistic community responded? How has it, artists that you have interviewed or focused on, have they given you any feedback? And how that might be different or the same as your international office?
You mean the reception might be
Yeah.
different across the,
Yeah.
yeah, I've never really thought about that. Some people have read it. I've been surprised. I didn't really expect many people to read it. In Thailand, yeah. I mean, generally, actually, but particularly in Thailand, right? It's not easy reading. It's not light reading, right? My writing, unfortunately, is quite thick. And yeah, I mean, there's a language proficiency issue too, which is palpable for some of the artists, even some of the artists I know very well. Reading it as text on a page would be really arduous, right? And maybe not fun at all. So, you don't expect terribly much, but I've been surprised a number of times by the kind of feedback I've gotten from people who've clearly read it closely. But I wouldn't say that that's a very large number of people. It's sold some copies in Thailand, like it's in bookshops there, and you can buy it there, and people they tell me, which is great. But yeah, I mean, there's very little in like, if you're thinking about sort of critical exchanges, that there's very little. It's more just like anecdotally, I can tell you, I've bumped into people and they've said something about it, and of course that's gratifying, but it's often been surprising. I didn't assume that no one would read it, but I assumed that not that many people would get really into it. So that's nice. As for the difference between there and elsewhere, yeah, I mean, where is that elsewhere? I don't know that there are many places that really read books about Southeast Asian contemporary art. This was the first book about Thai contemporary art of this nature, like that's kind of like a, at least pretending to be a serious academic study of Thai art since 1992, I think is when Apinan's book came out. And you're pitching to publishers, and you think on one level you think, oh, this is great, right? There hasn't been a book since '92, and then you start to think, maybe there's a reason for that. Like nobody really buys and reads books about Thai contemporary art, right? So that's when it has been. I mean, there's been a number of reviews, and they've been. I'm happy to say they've been thoughtful and engaged and critical reviews. But yeah, I mean, I don't really know how to characterize like international reception. It's really hard to glean that actually. I guess all I can say is that like I got job security out of it. Like that's kind of been the more, and that was really the main impetus for making the book, which is like a horrible way to try to sell a book. But that really was why I did it. I think I'm lucky that the outcome was kind of nice, but that I got across that hurdle, and then I sort of moved on to the next thing. So yeah. Sorry, it's not a more juicier answer.
More questions? Yeah, Inti.
It's very banal, but can you tell us a bit about the covers of the books?
Yeah.
What are they? Is it things that you thought about?
Okay, so
You have a slide, I think.
sorry.
You have a slide of.
Oh yeah, that's right. I do. Yeah, I had very little to do with the cover of the After All book, I have to say. I was very preoccupied doing other things at the time, and there were a small number, maybe 3 images from the archive. And this is kind of, I guess, worth mentioning that most of the work that I did on the Chiang Mai Social Installation Festivals was on the back of an existing archival project. It was put together mainly around the personal archive of Utit Atimana, who's one of the main sort of drivers of the festival. He's a quite senior teacher in the Art Academy well, actually not quite in the Art Academy, but in the university in Chiang Mai. I mean, he had kept, as one of the main organisers, he had kept far and away the biggest collection of stuff. He'd kept it in very good order. And there had been previous archival attempts to kind of make sense of this material, curiously not for kind of research purposes as such, but for exhibition purposes. And this is part of this kind of cycle of, the newly historicising turn in Asian contemporary art, mainly for exhibition and mainly outside of Thailand. The archive had been exhibited in one archival display as part of a big group show put together by Apinan Posianon in Bangkok, a big kind of national, idiotic, grand national survey show. And they'd made carved out a kind of archival section for this in there. And then it had been and this is where the money came from, ACC in Gwangju, South Korea, and also then in Sunshower, right, the big kind of Southeast Asia survey in Japan, right? So it was mainly for showing that there had been this kind of investment in picking up and trying to do something with this material. Gritia Gawiwong, who's a curator in Bangkok, is easily the kind of the central figure in this process. She was the one who mediated in a lot of these cases. So we had actually a very good archive at our disposal. Curiously, when I said nobody had ever mentioned an artwork in all of my conversations about Chiang Mai, also nobody had ever suggested that I should look at the archive. Right? I didn't know that there was quite so much there, and nobody had ever said, oh, maybe you should go and look at U Thit's stuff, right? It was just assumed that it had all kind of, by entropy, just kind of, rotted into the leaf matter on the ground, right? And so even that was a sort of a discovery for me, just to be confronted with the kind of massive materials. I'm not an archive researcher particularly, so I'm not very good at archives, but I did get a lot out of it. In that process, we kind of progressively whittled down a kind of short list of images that we thought was, for one reason or another, kind of nice, representations of what the book was about. Not about what the festivals were about necessarily, but what our research project was about. This one, because it's kind of in public space, it's around Taipei, like what the main kind of sites. It's there's no individual is recognizable in it. That was also nice. There are various reasons, and then there was a debate about which they should have, and I didn't actually pick it. I can't remember which one I wanted, maybe this one. Anyway, so they just the publishers just kind of picked one. For this one, this is a work by Pratya Pintong, which is a kind of like, it was a bit after the fact actually. It happened after the period that I was mainly researching. For this project, originally for a festival in Austria, he got his artist's fee. And what he often does is he uses his artist's fee and he kind of converts it into something else as part of his practice. And in this case, there had been a situation where Thaksin's sister, the former Prime Minister's sister, who was then herself Prime Minister, had been kicked out of power, or was in the process of being kicked out, on the pretext, among other things, that she had, in a kind of criminally negligent way, overseen or not properly overseen a rice buying scheme, which was like a government scheme to reward farmers a certain price for their yield, basically in order to buy votes in the countryside, which is what you do if you want to get into power in Thailand, to basically guarantee rice farmers, which is a relatively small chunk of the population these days, but nevertheless politically important constituency, to buy rice at a certain price that was almost twice the market rate. Right? This resulted in massive losses to the public purse, and was one of the main pretexts that the military, following the military junta that came in after her deposition by military coup, used to kind of justify their coup, right? That she had so badly butchered this scheme that the public coffers were empty, which of course they weren't, but so she was really pilloried for this, and it was a huge political stink about that. Now, what Pratya did was he went to a farmer who was involved in this ill-fated scheme, because the government ran out of money, or that fund was run dry through graft and mismanagement, as many government funds are in Southeast Asia, as I'm sure you're aware. There were a lot of farmers left empty-handed, and many of them committed suicide. In the case that Pratya was, the person he was in touch with had not committed suicide, but all he had to show for it was the contract. Which is a contract saying the Ministry of Commerce is going to pay me this much baht for my yield of X tons, right? But he didn't have any money. And so Pratya got his artist fee from Austria, and he exchanged that artist fee for the contract. Right, so he effectively bought the contract off this guy, and then he uses the contract as part of his installation physically. He had it translated and then installed, but also he creates installations with the equivalent weight of rice that is mentioned in the contract, right? So he's used this in a number of installations, and this is kind of the last edition of that body of work, in which he made an exhibition in Paris of that work in his commercial gallery in Paris, which is called GB Agency, using exactly what I've described, but then at the same time he kind of linked that to a project at the BACC, which is in downtown Bangkok, where he wanted in some way to create a sort of portal that connected the two shows, where he reconstructed in the forecourt of the BACC, which is very, very public space in the centre of Bangkok's retail district. He recreated the Parisian gallery space, but instead of doing the rice installation, which I think would have been probably a very tricky thing politically to do there, he installed this photograph, which had also been in the Paris show, which is a lightbox, photograph on a lightbox of the night of the coup that deposed Yingluck Shinawatra as Prime Minister. And in that night, so it was a snapshot of commerce, if you like, but of commerce still. Because you'll note that unlike... Oh, do I have both of them? I think I do, at the front, right? Unlike most 7-Elevens in central Bangkok at night, there is nobody going in and out. So 7-Eleven is a ubiquitous kind of mark in the landscape in Bangkok, and it's not just kind of like global commerce. It stands for small business. It's really part of the kind of mercantile kind of sociality as well as the kind of economy. But to see these spaces deserted, this was on a night when a curfew was declared, is really in itself something quite eerie and weird. So it was really an image of the sort of breakdown of exchange, right, or the breakdown of a series of economic exchanges. So yeah, I just always thought, and again, I didn't choose actually. I didn't choose the title of my book either.
Oh wow.
Authors don't name books. So the publisher chose the image. In this case, I provided 3 that I particularly thought might be good, and the publisher picked one.
Another question.
Hello, we're actually students, and we're just learning about perspectives in art history. And I'm interested when you said you were avoiding formally derived methods.
Yep.
So I'm curious, when as students of art history, and we're interested also in art historiography in the Asian context. I guess specifically in the Philippines. So I was wondering what general guidelines you have for us, like when we write art history, what are general guidelines we can follow to avoid largely Western concepts or categories?
A great question. A tremendously difficult thing to answer succinctly, however. I don't think that you need to avoid Western ways of doing art history. I think you need to do them critically, right? When I say I wanted to get away from sort of formally derived ways of studying art, it's not because I don't want that to happen. It's just that I don't want to do it, for this project, I didn't want to do it particularly. But I think I'm nevertheless more and more grateful for the training that I had, and the training that I had was more or less, Western. So there's no general guideline, I would say, but I would say don't disavow it, right? Those Western tools are still tools, and you can do other things with them different to what people have done with them so far. In the Philippines, you're fortunate, I think, because you have really a good corpus of local art history that has done this already to some extent, like to a very considerable extent that hasn't been matched, I think, elsewhere in Southeast Asia. That's probably arguable, but my feeling is that the Philippines is not badly off when it comes to reflexive and sort of self-aware ways of doing art history, at least post-colonial ones, right? And this, of course, is also has its limitations, but I think is a very healthy way of leavening art historical discourse. To kind of to reset some of its priorities and reset some of its focal points. I think the Philippines is not badly equipped in that respect, and so my advice would be, it's like Deleuze said about philosophy, right? You want to creep up behind it and give it a child that it didn't know it wanted, but which is nevertheless unmistakably its own. Right? Like, you need to be in this discourse. You need to be connected to that historiography, but you also need to transform it, right? So you want to infiltrate, I think, as much as you might want to put it aside sometimes. I know that's not very useful advice. But
Maybe last question. How do we account for artists who have no currency?
It's a very good one.
Because there can be artists, no?
Are they still artists? Yes. Are they still contemporary? Yes, possibly, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think the art world, we should acknowledge that the art world already has a system for discovering those artists. There's a whole series of kind of outsider exhibitions, for example, which is one of the means that this happens. But I think also art history and the market is constantly doing this anyway, right? The market has been a very efficient force for doing that. Who doesn't yet have currency is more the question, right? Who doesn't yet have currency? How can I get currency out of that? How can I generate currency? Right? So I think that does happen, and that's maybe a bit of a glib answer, but a more wholesome answer would be that, I think it's possible to be contemporary without being international, for example, right? I think there is a contemporaneity that gets articulated in sometimes very small theatres, right? And I think it's importantly contemporary. And the fact that it doesn't get outside of that it doesn't have a kind of pickup or purchase in a bigger terrain, doesn't mean it's not contemporary. I think what it means is that we have this problem of we shouldn't assume that its horizons are therefore parochial. Right? So this, I think, is maybe a pragmatic way of answering. There are many artists still, modern artists, if you like, or even modernists of Southeast Asia, who have not really received any kind of recognition, even in their national sort of institutional frameworks, right? And it's an important labour of people like us to find ways of giving them that national currency, right? Let's not make that a kind of box out of which they will never escape, right? Even if they're dead already, right? The artists in Southeast Asia, I mean, this region has been connected to the world by satellite electronic communications for 50 years, right? And there's a lot of modern art water under the bridge in that 50 years, right? And none of it is as parochial as it might seem, right? So I think this is sort of how I would now describe maybe the vocation, the calling of people like me anyway. It's that, how can we do justice to even sometimes, very, very local, microcosmic sort of articulations of contemporary experience, without sort of limiting the interpretation or the significance of what they did to that very parochial frame.
I think on that note on justice, I would like to thank David Tay for the presentation.
Thank you very much.